The thought that just told you this probably won't apply to you. That thought is the exact evidence that it does. There is a voice that has narrated your entire life. It knows your full name. It knows your failures. It knows every argument you've ever lost, every time you came close and didn't make it, every night you lay down cataloging the distance between who you are and who you'd imagined you would be by now. And this voice has been with you so long, spoken so consistently and with such total familiarity, that you have stopped experiencing it as a voice at all. You have started experiencing it as truth. You have started experiencing it as you. I need you to sit with one possibility for the next few minutes. Not as a thought experiment. As a hypothesis about your specific, actual life. What if the voice that tells you what you're capable of, what you deserve, what kind of person you fundamentally are, what if that voice is not yours? What if it was built before you were old enough to question it, installed quietly and without ceremony before you had any framework for what was happening, and has been running ever since, narrating your life from the inside, in a voice so close and so constant that it never once occurred to you to check whether it was actually your own? Because if that's true, and I'm going to show you exactly why it is, then the problem was never your discipline. It was never your potential. It was never your follow-through, your character, or the specific arrangements of your personality. The problem was that nobody ever taught you the difference between the voice you were given and the voice that is actually yours. And every time you tried to improve yourself while believing that voice was you, you were engaged in a war that could never be won, because you were fighting yourself with yourself, and neither the fighter nor the enemy was entirely real. Here is what almost no one tells you about the way human minds are actually built. Before the age of roughly 7, you did not have the cognitive architecture to evaluate what you were told about yourself. The part of the brain that weighs evidence, considers alternatives, and decides what to believe was still forming. Which means every judgment you absorbed during those years went directly into your operating system without passing through any filter. The word apparent repeated without realizing how often they said it. The expression on a teacher's face when you gave the wrong answer in front of everyone and felt the whole room shift. The quiet atmosphere in a house where certain kinds of ambition were never spoken about, but their absence shaped everything. The offhand comment from an older sibling that calcified, over years, into a permanent fact about who you are. These weren't necessarily dramatic moments. They didn't need to be. They were ordinary. They were Tuesday afternoons and Sunday dinners and unremarkable drives home from school. And they were quietly carving the lenses through which you would eventually see everything, including yourself. Think about a specific belief you hold about yourself. Not one you've worked on consciously. The baseline one, the quiet certainty underneath all of the growth work, the one that waits patiently for the motivation to fade and the room to empty. That you are fundamentally not quite enough. Or that you talk too much, or not enough. That you need to be useful to deserve space in a room. That ambition in your particular case always ends in something bruising, so it's wiser to scale back before you begin. Sit with where that one came from. Trace it backwards. Does it sound like your voice, your specific, particular way of moving through the world? Or does it carry someone else's cadence, someone else's fear, someone else's exhaustion, wearing your name? You cannot argue yourself out of a belief you absorbed before you had arguments. This is the central structural failure of most self-improvement. You try harder. You read more. You build better habits, better systems, better morning routines. And for a while something genuinely shifts, you feel it, and it's real. But then, quietly and reliably, you drift back. Not because you failed. Not because you lacked the capacity. Because you were using a borrowed tool to fight a borrowed belief, and you were doing it while standing completely inside a borrowed story about what you are made of. The strategy and the obstacle were constructed from the same material. Of course it didn't hold. You were trying to remodel a house with the original blueprint, while never once asking who drew it or whether the drawing was accurate, and this is where it becomes uncomfortable in a very particular way. Because most people who've done serious self-improvement work, and you are likely one of them, have built a sophisticated, intelligent relationship with their own psychology. You know your patterns. You can name your tendencies. You've sat with difficult things about yourself and not looked away. You understand the mechanisms well enough to watch yourself enact them in real time. And yet something remains stuck. Something beneath all of that understanding simply refuses to move. And if you look closely, the thing that won't shift isn't a behavior. It isn't a habit. It's a belief, a quiet, foundational certainty, wearing your voice, that says, this is just who you are. The most sophisticated prison is the one you've mistaken for your own mind. Now pay close attention, because what follows changes how everything before it looks. You've been fighting this voice. That's the assumption buried underneath every self-improvement attempt, every disciplined morning, every moment you decided that today would be different. You've been treating the borrowed belief as an opponent, something to overpower, outlast, or eventually convince with enough accumulated evidence of your own capability. But here is what that approach never accounted for: you cannot out-discipline a belief you accepted before discipline was even a concept you possessed. You cannot argue past something that arrived before you had language for it. And beyond that, the fight itself keeps the borrowed voice at the absolute center of everything. Every time you decide to resist it, you are quietly confirming that it defines the room. That your life's interior is organized as a response to it. That your job is to push back. You have been giving it the floor every time you stepped up to refuse it. And it has been winning, not because it is stronger than you, but because you never once questioned whether it was actually yours to fight. The practice that genuinely changes this doesn't fight the voice. It questions the premise. It asks not how do I overcome this, but did I ever actually choose this? And that distinction, seemingly small, psychologically enormous, is the difference between spending your life rearranging furniture in someone else's house and realizing, finally, that you are allowed to walk out the door. There is a specific 4-minute window, just before sleep, when the conscious filtering layer of the mind loosens. This is not mystical, it is neurological. The brain shifts into a hypnagogic state where the boundary between what is accepted and what is questioned softens considerably. Most people use this window without realizing it. They review their day through the lens of the borrowed voice, cataloging what went wrong, measuring themselves against a standard they didn't write, and fall asleep having quietly reinforced exactly what they most want to release. But this same window, precisely because the filtering loosens, is where something else entirely becomes possible. In those 4 minutes, before sleep tonight, ask this question. Not urgently. Not as a demand. Quietly, as if asking someone you have known your entire life but are only now beginning to see clearly, is this thought something I chose? Or did someone else choose it for me? You don't need an answer. The answer is not the point. The pause that comes before the answer, that small, charged gap between hearing a thought and accepting it as true, that is where the work actually lives. In that pause, you begin to feel the seam. The distinction between what is genuinely yours and what arrived before you could evaluate it. You don't have to trace it all the way back. You don't have to name it perfectly. You only have to feel that the seam is there. From that pause, some phrases emerge naturally, not as affirmations, not as commands you must believe before they work, not as replacements for the voice you're sorting through. Simply as statements of sorting, The way you might sort through belongings in a house that came to you half furnished with someone else's things. What is mine, I keep. What was never mine, I release. Say it in the quiet without effort or expectation. What belongs to you will loosen toward you. What never belonged will carry a slight wrongness you'll recognize even if you can't name it, like a word you've said so many times it momentarily stops sounding like a word. Try it with specifics. With I am someone who never finishes what I start, and ask whether that is genuinely your observation about your own nature, or whether someone who gave up repeatedly passed you their pattern before you knew what you were receiving. With I need to earn my rest, and ask whether that is your value, or someone else's anxiety about worthiness that arrived early and set up quietly in a room you didn't know existed. With I am too much and I am not enough, both of which, it is worth noticing, cannot simultaneously be accurate about a single person, yet are often believed with equal conviction by the same person. Ask who measured you, what they were working with when they took the measurement, and whether you ever agreed to stand still long enough to be measured in the first place. The most dangerous beliefs are never the dramatic ones. They're the quiet ones that arrived so early they left no memory attached to them, only a sensation of certainty. When people begin doing this in earnest, not as a concept, but as a consistent nightly practice, what happens is specific and far quieter than expected. There is no sudden confidence. No burst of clarity, no morning where everything is abruptly different. Those would be the wrong things to look for, still organized around the old story where change means becoming more formidable. What actually happens is subtler. A familiar thought arrives, one that used to land with total, unquestioned authority, and there is a pause. A small but unmistakable gap. Not because the thought stopped coming. Because you can hear, for the first time, that it came from somewhere else. Like noticing that a sound you'd always believed was inside your walls is actually coming from next door. And in that pause, something else becomes audible. Something beneath the borrowed noise, patient in a way that would almost break your heart if you understood how long it had been waiting. Not your ambition. Not your capability. Something stranger and more original, the simple experience of being a person who has not yet been fully defined by everything they inherited. The actual self. Not performing recovery, not narrating its own healing. Just present, in the way original things are present, underneath the frequency of everything that was installed over it. You were never broken. You were quiet beneath someone else's noise. When the borrowed voice quiets, even briefly, even imperfectly, the first experience is often not relief but an odd, disorienting silence. Because you have been organized around this voice for so long, even in opposition to it, that its absence creates a kind of strangeness. And in that strangeness, the temptation is to fill it immediately, with another framework, another system, another borrowed structure to stand in while the inherited noise settles. Anything to avoid the unfamiliar sensation of being, finally, a little alone with yourself. You don't have to become someone different. You only have to return to someone original, someone who was never destroyed, only covered. Not by failure. Not by the accumulated proof that the borrowed voice was occasionally right about something. Just by the weight of everything that was handed to you before you were old enough to examine it in the light and decide what you actually wanted to keep. Tonight, you don't have to fight anything. You only have to ask one question, quietly, in the loosening space before sleep, as if asking someone you've always known but rarely truly heard, is this thought mine? You don't need the answer tonight. You only need the pause. In that pause, the gap between hearing a thought and deciding it is you, that is where you begin to find what was always there, waiting with more patience than you will probably ever fully understand you deserved. You have been hearing that voice your entire life. Tonight, you begin learning to tell the difference. It will feel like very little. It will change everything. Tell me below, what is one belief about yourself that you're starting to suspect was never actually yours? And if this conversation opens something you've been trying to name for a long time, there are more waiting for you here, about the hidden architecture of how we think, the quiet costs of borrowed beliefs, and what becomes possible when we begin returning to what was always genuinely ours. Subscribing means the next one finds you.